I never imagined that a single moment could completely shake my world, but it all began on a quiet afternoon. The kind where everything feels unnaturally still, as though the air itself is holding its breath. The morning had been ordinary enough, cleaning the house, checking off chores, and trying to ignore the dull ache in my body that seemed louder than usual. It was one of those days where time seemed to stretch endlessly, every second feeling heavier than the last. Derek, my husband, had left for work, and I thought I'd sneak in a quick nap. The house was so silent that even the soft ticking of the clock seemed amplified, almost oppressive. That's when I heard a knock on the door. It was Jackson, my 24-year-old nephew. Over the years, Jackson had grown from a shy boy into a confident young man, strikingly handsome and self-assured. But lately there was something different about him. His gaze lingered just a fraction too long, carrying a weight I couldn't quite understand. "Aunt Laura, you look exhausted," Jackson said as he stepped inside. His voice was warm, kind even, but there was something just beneath the surface, something I couldn't put my finger on. "Can I help with anything?" I forced a small smile, feeling the exhaustion tug at my every word. "A back rub would be nice, if you don't mind." He paused for a moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded. "Of course." Jackson moved behind me, his hands pressing into my shoulders with deliberate firmness. At first, I tried to relax, telling myself there was nothing unusual about this. He'd done this before, helping out when I was tired. But this time it felt different. His touch lingered, deliberate in a way that made the air between us feel dense, almost suffocating. "Is that better?" he asked softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He was so close that I could feel his breath brush against my neck, sending a chill down my spine. "Yes," I replied, though my body was telling a different story. My heart raced, my thoughts spun, and an uneasy tension began to creep in. Something felt off, his touch, his tone, the way he seemed too close. Then his hands moved lower, his fingertips pressing into my back in a way that felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to pull away, but I was frozen in place. When he spoke again, his words sent a shock through my entire being. "You've been so strong, Aunt Laura," he murmured. "You deserve to feel something more." Time seemed to stand still. I couldn't process what he was saying, couldn't make sense of the shift in his words and actions. His hand slid further down, brushing against places that made my body tense with alarm. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew better. "Aunt Laura, are you okay?" His voice was soft, almost tender, but there was something in his tone that made me feel trapped. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body felt like it was shutting down, my mind racing to figure out what to do. Then he said the words that made everything crystal clear. "You've always been so beautiful," he whispered, his voice carrying an intensity I had never heard before. I turned slightly, just enough to see his face. His eyes were dark, filled with something that wasn't the Jackson I knew. This wasn't my nephew. This was someone else entirely. The room seemed to shrink around us, the tension becoming unbearable. "Jackson, stop," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. But he didn't stop. His hands lingered, his words slicing through the silence. "Don't worry, Aunt Laura," he said, his tone calm but unsettling. "I won't hurt you." But there was an edge to his voice, a quiet intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, as if the weight of the moment was holding me in place. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Finally, he pulled away, and the tension snapped like a rubber band. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. Jackson's demeanor shifted instantly, his face relaxing into a casual smile, as though nothing had happened. "You okay, Aunt Laura?" he asked, his tone light, almost playful. I nodded, though the words felt like poison on my tongue. Yeah, I lied, unable to say anything else. But I knew things had changed. I couldn't look at him the same way. The familiarities of our relationship was gone, replaced by a lingering discomfort that clung to every thought. How do you confront something so unnerving, so surreal? In the days that followed, I tried to avoid him. I left the house more often, found excuses to be busy, but Jackson seemed to be everywhere. His calm presence was a constant reminder of the line he had crossed. His words echoed in my mind, twisting my thoughts. "You deserve to feel good." It was like a shadow I couldn't escape, growing darker with each passing day. One evening, I came home late. The house was dim and quiet, but something felt off. As I stepped into the living room, I saw him. Jackson was sitting there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and focused. The way the light hit his face made his expression seem almost sinister. "You're home late," he said, his voice smooth, almost teasing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I had work," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart raced. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "You don't have to pretend, Aunt Laura. I know what you're thinking." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Jackson smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, predatory. "You're afraid. Afraid of what we've done, and what we might do again." I felt panic rise in my chest. "You need to leave," I said, forcing the words out, though I could feel the tremor in my legs. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You can't run from this," he said softly. "We're connected now. You know it, even if you won't admit it." The sound of the front door opening shattered the tension. Derek's voice called out, breaking the spell. "Hey, everything okay in here?" Jackson's expression shifted instantly, his mask of innocence slipping back into place. "Just talking to Aunt Laura," he said smoothly, his tone light and casual. I nodded, unable to speak. That night, as I lay in bed, Jackson's words played over and over in my mind. "You'll come back to me." A chill ran through me. This wasn't over. Deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. In the following days, I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected noise made me flinch. My heart was in a constant state of vigilance, anticipating Jackson's next move. He had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed, yet he moved around as if nothing had happened, his demeanor calm and unnervingly normal. I started locking my bedroom door at night. It wasn't much, but it gave me a small sense of security. Derek didn't notice the subtle changes in my behavior. He had always been oblivious to the small details, brushing off my unease as stress or fatigue. I didn't have the courage to tell him the truth. How could I? The shame, the confusion, it all tangled into a knot in my chest that I couldn't unravel. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen trying to distract myself with a book, Jackson walked in. His presence filled the room like a heavy fog, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin crawl. I focused on the words in front of me, pretending not to notice. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone light, but with an edge that made my pulse quicken. "I've been busy," I replied, keeping my eyes on the page. Jackson chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "Busy, huh? You used to make time for me." My grip on the book tightened. Things change. He leaned against the counter, his gaze piercing. "Not everything." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to check on dinner, and left the room. My hands trembled as I busied myself with pots and pans, the sound of boiling water doing little to drown out the chaos in my mind. That night, I dreamed of him. The vividness of it left me shaken, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring. In the dream, he was everywhere, his voice, his touch, his presence suffocating me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The darkness of the room felt oppressive, the silence deafening. I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The next morning, while Derek was getting ready for work, I hesitated at the bathroom door. My reflection in the mirror looked fragile, like a version of myself I barely recognized. "Derek," I began, my voice trembling. He looked at me through the mirror, his expression curious but distracted. "Yeah." I opened my mouth to speak but hesitated. How could I put it into words? How could I tell him that the boy we'd watched grow up was no longer someone I could trust? "Nothing," I muttered, retreating back into silence. He nodded, oblivious, and continued shaving. I hated myself for not saying anything, but fear and doubt held me captive. That day, I decided to visit my sister, Jackson's mother. Perhaps she could sense something was off with him, too. Maybe I wasn't alone in this. When I arrived, her house felt warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold tension I'd been living in. She greeted me with a hug, her cheerful demeanor a balm to my frayed nerves. We talked about mundane things at first, family, work, the weather, but eventually I steered the conversation toward Jackson. "Have you noticed anything different about him lately?" I asked carefully, watching her reaction. She frowned, her expression thoughtful. "Different? Not really. He's been a bit quiet lately, but you know how young men are." I nodded, though her words offered little reassurance. "Quiet? That wasn't the Jackson I knew." "Why do you ask?" she pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, no reason," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just curious." The conversation moved on, but the weight in my chest remained. As I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was completely alone in this. That night, the tension reached a breaking point. I was in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Jackson standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. I stood, every muscle in my body tensed. "About what?" He stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "You know what?" My heart pounded in my chest. "Jackson, you need to stop. This isn't right." His eyes darkened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Right? What's right, Aunt Laura? Pretending this doesn't exist." "There is nothing to pretend," I snapped, my voice rising. "Whatever you think this is, it isn't real." His jaw tightened, his composure slipping. "You don't mean that." "Yes, I do," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You need help, Jackson. This isn't normal." For a moment, I thought he might lash out. His hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. But then, just as quickly as the anger appeared, it faded. He stepped back, his expression unreadable once again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to scare you." I didn't respond, too stunned to process his sudden shift. He turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, my body trembling with adrenaline. In the days that followed, Jackson seemed to retreat into himself. He was quieter, his presence less suffocating, but the unease lingered. I couldn't tell if his apology was genuine or just another manipulation. Either way, I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I started looking into therapists, hoping to find someone who could help me navigate this nightmare. The weight of it all was too much to bear alone. But even as I sought answers, the question loomed: how do you confront a predator when the predator is family? The tension in the house didn't dissolve, it shifted, taking on a new form. Derek remained oblivious, Jackson remained a shadow, and I remained trapped in a cycle of fear and doubt. Each day felt like a battle, each interaction a test of my resolve. But I was determined to find a way out, no matter how long it took. I refused to let him control me, to let his actions define my life. I would reclaim my sense of safety, my peace of mind, even if it meant tearing my world apart to do so. This wasn't over, but I was ready to fight. Over the next few weeks, Jackson's behavior shifted into something even more insidious. While he was no longer overtly confrontational, his presence was suffocating. Every time I turned a corner in my own home, it felt like he was there, watching, lingering in the periphery of my vision. He wasn't doing anything explicitly wrong, but his silence and subtle glances were just as oppressive as his words had been. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. The walls that had once offered comfort and security now seemed to close in on me. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door set my heart racing. My mind began to play tricks on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was constantly being watched, even when Jackson wasn't around. One evening, Derek suggested that we invite Jackson to dinner. My heart sank at the thought, but I plastered on a smile and nodded. What could I say? That I didn't want Jackson here because he made my skin crawl. Derek would never understand. He'd dismiss it as me being overly sensitive. When Jackson arrived that evening, he was his usual charming self. He laughed easily, complimented my cooking, and even brought a bottle of wine as a gesture of goodwill. To anyone else, he seemed like the perfect nephew, polite, attentive, and endearing. But I knew better. Beneath the surface, there was a darkness that only I could see. Throughout the evening, Jackson's eyes rarely left me. Even as he engaged in conversation with Derek, his gaze would flicker toward me, lingering just long enough to make my stomach churn. I avoided meeting his eyes, focusing instead on the mundane details of the meal, cutting my food into tiny pieces, sipping water to distract myself. At one point, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of fetching dessert. As I stood at the counter, trying to steady my breathing, I felt him behind me. His presence was unmistakable, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "You've been quiet tonight," Jackson said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't turn around. "Just tired," I replied, my tone clipped. He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my neck. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Aunt Laura." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter behind me. "What do you want, Jackson?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. He tilted his head, his eyes studying me. "I just want you to stop pretending," he said, his tone calm, but laced with an undercurrent of menace. "Pretending what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "That you don't feel it too," he replied, his expression unreadable. At that moment, Derek's voice called out from the dining room, breaking the tension. "Laura, everything okay in there?" I seized the opportunity to step around Jackson, putting distance between us. "Just grabbing dessert," I called back, forcing a cheerful tone. My hands shook as I placed the plates of cake on a tray, my mind racing. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered long after Jackson left. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called a therapist and made an appointment. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of what was happening and guide me toward a solution. Keeping this secret was eating away at me, and I knew I couldn't face it alone. During my first session, I found it difficult to open up. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Whitaker, encouraged me to take my time. Her patience and understanding slowly chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. "It sounds like you're carrying a heavy burden," she said gently after I had shared some of the details. "But you don't have to carry it alone." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, hoped that I could reclaim my life and find a way to protect myself from Jackson's insidious presence. Dr. Whitaker suggested setting boundaries and finding ways to regain a sense of control. She also encouraged me to consider involving Derek, as having his support could make a significant difference. But the thought of telling Derek filled me with dread. How would he react? Would he believe me? Or would he side with Jackson, dismissing my concerns as paranoia? One evening, as I sat in the living room, lost in thought, Derek joined me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You've seemed distant lately," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. This was my chance to tell him, but fear held me back. Instead, I offered a weak smile. "Just tired," I said, the light tasting bitter on my tongue. Derek nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He didn't press further, and I was both relieved and disappointed. Part of me wanted him to see through my facade, to push me to open up. But another part of me was terrified of what might happen if I did. Over the next few weeks, Jackson's behavior grew more erratic. He would show up unannounced, his excuses flimsy and unconvincing. Each time I felt my anxiety spike, my body tensing as I prepared for whatever twisted game he was playing. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and my heart raced as I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight. As I moved through the house, checking the circuit breaker, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffle of footsteps. I turned quickly, the beam of light from my phone cutting through the darkness. Jackson stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by shadows. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was worried about you," he said, his tone unnervingly calm. "How did you even get in?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. "You left the door unlocked," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. I knew he was lying. I had made a habit of locking every door and window, double-checking them each night. The realization that he had found a way in despite my precautions sent a wave of fear crashing over me. "You need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move. "Why are you so afraid of me, Aunt Laura?" he asked, his tone soft but laced with a chilling intensity. "I would never hurt you." "Get out," I repeated, my voice firmer this time. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then he nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Okay," he said, turning to leave. As he walked out the door, he paused and looked back at me. "Good night, Aunt Laura." The door closed behind him, but the tension in the air remained. I locked the door and leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. This wasn't just about setting boundaries anymore. Jackson was escalating, and I knew I couldn't handle this on my own. The next day, I finally told Derek everything. I started from the beginning, recounting every uncomfortable encounter, every unsettling word, and every moment of fear. As I spoke, tears streamed down my face, and I braced myself for his reaction. To my relief, Derek believed me. His face darkened with anger as he listened, his hands clenching into fists. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hurt and frustration. "I was scared," I admitted. "I didn't know how you'd react, and I didn't want to cause a rift in the family." "This isn't your fault," Derek said firmly. "We'll handle this together." His support was a lifeline, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. But I also knew that confronting Jackson would be complicated. He was part of our family, and the fallout from exposing his behavior would be significant. Together, Derek and I began to take steps to protect ourselves and our home. We installed security cameras, changed the locks, and made it clear to Jackson that he was no longer welcome. It was a small victory, but it gave me a sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt in a long time. The battle wasn't over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. With Derek by my side and the guidance of Dr. Whitaker, I began to rebuild the pieces of my life that Jackson had tried to shatter. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to reclaim my sense of safety and peace. And though the shadows of the past still lingered, I refused to let them define my future. This was my life, and I was ready to take it back.